So as you've seen in the course of the day, here's Marty Whitmore, Russ George, Colby Pellegrino, Eric Kuhn, Eric Millis, and Andy Mueller, who's not the new guy anymore. So let me start with the person who started us off. It's Marty. So Marty, we heard some pretty significant challenges today about future use of water. You have most recently been the Montrose County attorney, so maybe you have some insight into knowledge of these things at the county government level. And then you live in rural Uray County and you have neighbors. So how might if some of these dire things come to pass, how prepared maybe are we at the governmental level or with your neighbors level? And what might we do to better prepare our constituents?
Well, I am delighted to say that quite a few of my friends and neighbors from Uray County as well as Montrose County are here today. And I encouraged by email yesterday anybody who hadn't already signed up to be sure and not forget that we were doing this today and to please show up. Darius Jutton from Uray County Water Users Association is here, and I know Darius is really anxious to make sure that the other water users in Uray County get the information that's here today, because many of them are out actually still trying to work and figure out what to do with what little hay they may have been able to grow this year, or some of them are selling their herds or half their herds. And so this has been a really tough water year for Uray County in particular. And we're certainly looking at options. We have a study underway kind of in line with the Colorado Water Plan to be sort of the Uray County Water Plan. And so we're looking at options from additional storage to efficiencies to new operating agreements, all kinds of, any idea that we can come up with. And so, so we're working to get that out to the public as well. And clearly, the information that was presented today has not been, we've not had an opportunity to have fully vetted. People have not heard about drought contingency plan. We have a Gunnison Basin roundtable meeting Monday, and there will be some additional discussion there. But the discussions we have had been very, very preliminary. And there's been no discussion to date about what agreements the state may be entering into. So I hope that our roundtables will be fully involved. I think, as Russ George pointed out this morning, they're very important. Our IBCC should be involved in these discussions. I don't believe they have yet either. And so I think there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had with water users over the implications of the potential drought contingency plan before it's fully adopted.
So clearly we have a lot of work to do as in the water community. Any questions yet? Because I can keep going. Oh, we have a question in the back.
I've got one over here, Jim.
Okay. I don't know where you are, but yeah.
Okay, hi. Rachel Richards, Pickens County Commissioner. Thank you all for your presentations this morning and very thorough information, if a little disheartening at some level. We've been all at this for years, the people in this room, and put in years on the state water plan and thought we've worked out really good compromises, and particularly the new thrust towards integrating land use management and water management. Water planning is land use planning in so many ways. I'm just wondering, how do we get some sort of equality if there's going to be curtailment of West Slope water through water banks and growing of alfalfa? How do we get the curtailment of bluegrass lawns on the Front Range, where whenever I'm down there, which is pretty frequent, I see new sod being laid every day around highway construction projects and new subdivisions? And how do we make sure the curtailment and the demand management really occurs on both sides of the slope?
Did you have a person in mind that you were directing that question to? Anybody? Okay. Anybody want to take a shot?
Go for it, Andy.
Yeah.
Andy. I will. Thank you, Rachel. I would say the way we do that, what you're talking about is land use. Land use is local control in our state, and we need better, tighter land use regulations throughout the state on water use, and not just on the east slope. We have bluegrass lawns going in new subdivisions on the west slope as well. I would say that the way we assure parity and equality and proportionality in terms of contributions to the demand management pool is through a commitment by our state agencies who will necessarily have to stand up such a program. And that's our Colorado Water Conservation Board and our state engineer, both part of the Division of Natural Resources or Department of Natural Resources. We need the board to affirm their staff's outreach and commitment to a voluntary compensated program. We need them to publicly, through policy, through resolution, adopt the principles that include that equitable distribution of demand management water. We need the state engineer to publicly affirm his commitment to that as well.
So that's Andy's about 5th or 6th throwdown on that subject this afternoon or today. So Russ, maybe would you want to take a crack at framing how Andy's thoughts might result?
CWCB has long been a leader in the statewide aspect of almost all issues, and certainly the drought conversation. And it's reaching pretty critical points simply because time is not our friend these days with the drought. And as long as everyone continues to work together, the CWCB will be a leader. We'll be there, and we've been trying to move as many resources from the state treasury into meaningful projects, and we'll continue to do that. And there'll always be a focus on conservation. Conservation is the first step towards accommodating reduced uses for drought purposes. So the challenge has long since been accepted. And will continue to be.
Any other questions? Here's a question over here. Microphone.
Hi, John Potter, Director of the Grand Valley Water Users Association. I have a question on something that Andy spoke about this morning, although I'd be interested in anybody who might have an opinion on it. Andy, in your pie chart, you showed that ag water in Colorado is about 1.3 million acre feet. And of that, you said, I believe, about 1.1 million is protected. It's pre-compact water. So from that, I conclude that probably about 200,000 acre feet would be the first target if we got into something involuntary or uncompensated. And you said also that it's about a 50-50 split between ag and municipal and industrial in Colorado, so I would assume that there's about 400,000 acre feet between those two that would be the first target. So I'm just wondering, do you feel like the 1.1 million agricultural that's pre-compact is pretty well protected, you know, if we got into something involuntary and uncompensated? And as a follow-up question, I'm bothered by the fact that the 1.3 million acre feet doesn't seem to take into account the return flows, and would be interested to hear anybody's thoughts on both of those questions.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. The 1.33 million acre feet on the western slope agriculture that is estimated to be consumed every year, that is a consumptive use. It's not the diversion rate. So it's the consumptive use. It's the water that's not returned to the stream. And in terms of it being protected from impacts if our state were to head into an involuntary curtailment situation that was forced by a call on the Colorado River from the lower basin, our fear is that no, although it's protected within our state from necessarily being turned off as a direct response, But what could happen is that our municipalities that have that hardened supply will see that call coming long before it hits. And where today it's a possibility under the risk studies that our districts have done, when it becomes a higher probability, those same municipal providers who have junior water rights that are subject to being turned off at the time of a call will go out and purchase and potentially permanently buy and dry West Slope Ag in order to send that water downstream to augment their junior diversions for their system. And they can do that voluntarily through market-based transactions. They also, if push comes to shove, have the power of condemnation to provide that for their municipalities. That power of condemnation hasn't been fully vetted. There are a couple court cases on it, but we would certainly be arguing that it's only for in-home and fire hydrant type uses, very essential uses. But that's an argument that would have to occur. So unfortunately, our senior ag rights are at risk if we don't prevent that call from ever coming on. And that's really where our focus is, and I think our state's focus is how do you avoid that from happening. But the post-compact depletions are about equal on the west slope and the east slope. So and the east slope is not all M&I. There's a significant portion of that is agriculture. So when we say that we want to see parity, we want to see it based on that post-compact depletion contributing demand management water.
We have a quick question here. And while the microphone's coming forward, Eric Millis, I'm going to just ask you a question because Utah is my second favorite state. So you've heard all this concern about irrigated ag here in Colorado. Are these kind of concerns coming out of the producing economy, the agricultural economy in Utah? And is there a greater concern for the loss of way of life and economy and things like that?
I haven't heard so much of that. As we were around talking with people, trying to encourage them to join in with the system conservation pilot program, we heard people say, well, you're just taking our water and selling it downstream. And I think we've got people over that point. We do hear people in the Uinta Basin, which is just adjacent here, and other agricultural areas talk very much about their way of life and the importance of agriculture to the state of Utah. And I think you hear some people sound as though maybe they feel like there's a little bit of a threat there, but I think by and large, no. And I think the agricultural community exists very happily in their place and are doing well. So
one of my colleagues in the water community is wears the Central Utah Project, and she told me that the water banking conversations emerging in Utah is. Can you help us with where's the status of that?
And I don't have a whole lot of detail on that, but I know there is a lot of discussion. There was a bill that was introduced into the state legislature last year that didn't go anywhere. They're talking about revisiting again this year. I think there's a lot more enthusiasm for water banking in Utah than there had been in the past. And seeing the opportunity to share water supplies and make that process an easier process. We don't have to go get a permanent change of diversion and place of use from the state engineer's office and that sort of thing. But anyway, being able to streamline that. So I think the discussion will actually lead to something this year and things that people are positive and talking highly about right now.
Thank you. We got a question here.
Yes. My question is the federal legislation for the DCPs that you mentioned. What is that? Does that go to the natural resources committees, or could you explain the process of what federal legislation is for the DCPs?
Where's Chris Treese when you need him? We have our federal affairs specialist at the district could probably answer that better than anyone else. And he's right over there, so if you'll talk to Chris in terms of the exact process that's followed, frankly, which process and which committee would be designed to be the originating committee is probably, someone's thinking about that. I can tell you it certainly isn't me, and based on the blank looks on the faces up here, I don't think it's anybody up at this table. So I probably can't answer that.
Question, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you. First, congratulations to the River District on a great seminar, great set of speakers, and for all of you being here, taking part, and especially our friends from out of state. It's a trek for you to come, so glad to see you here. I'd like to direct this question to Russ George, and Russ, glad you're here as well, and you've been deemed the father of the Water for the 21st Century Act, and you mentioned a couple uncles along the way, and I appreciate that too. But I think Marty kind of touched on a question I'm curious to hear your opinion about. And you know, things have changed. We know more now than when the act first passed. What do you view the role of the Basin Roundtable and the IBCC in the current discussions about drought contingency planning? And more importantly, maybe if it goes beyond the discussion about voluntary, compensated, temporary that our district supports.
Well, I agree totally with the way Marty put it. And it causes me, your question causes me to recall the guidelines that are written into the Interbasin Compact Charter. And it lays out very succinctly how we are to conduct our business. And it guides the IBCC and each of the roundtables into these very questions that we're talking about and wrestling with. And it's very strong on the concept that we would look after our own interests, but not at the expense of anybody else. And that's really what we've been talking about all day, is how do you recognize that the drought reaches us all, and we all have responsibility to respond. But we are ethically and morally bound not to respond on the backs of somebody else. And that is best discussed and prevented in the roundtables. And the roundtables should be having this conversation, and you've given them the challenge. I suspect it's happening. Position to continue. I would like to see the roundtables look for the unseen, yet known solutions to some of this, and get them right to their neighboring roundtables. And the IBCC is essentially the place to take it, so that you can get a larger conversation going. Sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned, because in the end, we should only be accepting drought solutions that are fair to all corners of the state.
I just wanted to thank everyone for their presentations today. They were very informative. My question is for the panel, and it's kind of considering the future. Looking forward to the renegotiation of the 2026 guidelines for the coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, are there any issues that the panelists believe have not previously been addressed by the 2007 guidelines or the DCPs that they foresee being part of the 2026 negotiations? Thank you.
Go first. And then I'll let Colby go next. You know, the 2026, you know, what happens after 2026 is sort of the big question. I think we're all moving in the right direction, but it's going to take some leadership, I think, on the part of the basin to step away from some of our historical chains on things like what's the upper basin's delivery obligation to Mexico, and the lower basin's overuse. The way I personally see it is a successful renegotiation of this we'll take a couple of bigger steps that we've been unwilling to take so far. First is there will not be a drought contingency plan. A drought contingency plan is, in my view, a Band-Aid that gets us through 2026. Post-2026, we'll have in place a process that will address a solution to the structural deficit in the lower basin, so it will be a sustainable use of water as opposed to a Band-Aid that we use when we don't have enough water. And the second thing is, I think we're going to have to look at the river as a system that goes literally from Greeley, Fort Collins, all the way to Mexico. A good example of that is right now in western Colorado, Grand Junction, Aspen, Carbondale, Upper Eagle. Lynn, what do you guys see? You're on drought. You're restricting water use throughout the basin. Those folks that are directly in the basin are really in a drought mode. We're doing things to reduce our consumptive use. We're restricting turf, if you want to call it. That's not happening on the Front Range right now. Now, you can say because of the weather on the Front Range, they've had a decent monsoon season. We haven't had any monsoon at all in the West Slope to speak of. They do not, Denver Water right now is not asking any even voluntary restrictions. Neither is Northern. And all of those users of the Colorado River are going to have to start thinking as Lake Powell is in danger, as it's dropping, they're going to have to be a part of the solution in restricting turf. So in my view, a successful post-renegotiations will address some of these historical problems where we've disagreed and we don't want to go to court. So let's figure out a way to get around them. Let's deal with the reality on the river, and let's look at the river as a system where Lake Powell and Lake Mead are a part of the solutions, but everyone's going to participate in managing the river in a sustainable way, literally from Greeley to Mexico. And I say Greeley because their Trans Mountain diversions go to Greeley. For that matter, Trans Mountain diversion water goes to Cheyenne. So everyone essentially around the Colorado River Basin is going to have to participate in a sustainable solution post-2026. So with that, I'd like to hear Colby's thoughts.
I think that what Eric had to say was very well put. The guidelines were temporary for a reason, and that was because there were two reasons. One, to learn from actual operating experience, and two, because no one wanted to make the really hard decisions. That's evidenced by reconsultation and many other aspects of the guidelines. I don't think that we still want to make some of those hard decisions as we sit here today. And I think that whatever we do, particularly if it's drastically different, people are still not going to want it to be permanent. If the last 18 years has showed us anything, it's that what we thought the future would be was certainly a lot worse than we thought it was 18 years ago. So I think in order to be successful, we have to find a way to put aside our fundamental arguments over 602A storage elevations and overuse in the lower basin, and indeed take a system-wide approach of what does it make sense for everyone to be doing, of course based on their legal positions and based upon what we all agree on. But there are things that we've learned that should be addressed. The modeling did not show that we would have this many consecutive years of a 9 million acre foot release from the upper basin. It wasn't something that was in there. I don't think that was intended, but it's something we've learned, and it's certainly something that should be addressed when we move forward. Now, you can argue this both ways. The lower basin would have been in shortage sooner, yes, but the upper basin would have equalized by now too. So there are still checks and balances that are valuable that we shouldn't lose sight of in the current operational framework. And I think what will truly make us unsuccessful is if everyone comes to the table trying to stake their claim on what they think their most firm legal argument is. because then we'll end up in a place where we're trying to pick winners and losers instead of trying to find a way for the basin to move forward together.
A question back here.
Yes, you know, we've all heard so much, and we're all so aware how the water levels, Lake Powell, Lake Mead are approaching critical levels. And if it, in fact it hits those critical levels, the impact that's going to have on in so many different ways. How is putting a pipeline into Lake Powell to bring water over to the St. George area, isn't that just going to add an additional demand and exasperate or aggravate that whole challenge?
Is that one for me?
Yeah, most likely.
I think we're going to let you answer it. So that's a great question, and one that I think every one of the Upper Basin states that still has some thought and intention of developing more of its share of the Colorado need to ask, and for sure that project will draw water directly out of Lake Powell. We've gone through modeling and calculations to see what the impact would be. The Bureau's modeling includes the Lake Powell pipeline. It's one of those projects that's you know, close enough in the planning stages that it's been included in modeling. We just we understand, you know, and seems like maybe it's counter to the efforts that we try to make in drought contingency planning. Yet, all of the states believe they have the right to develop and use their share of the river, and that's where we're coming from. We understand it will have impacts, but even with the project in place, you know, the modeling shows that it's not going to have that big an effect on either Lake Powell or the river downstream of Glen Canyon Dam. Does that help?
Yeah, I'd like to add one comment as somebody who's retired, so I can say this, but maybe not. But one of the things we need to look at is again, focus on facts. And the reality is, in the Upper Basin, our water uses have been essentially flat since about the late 1980s. The consumptive uses and losses report are out there. You can find them online. They might not use the best, the latest technical information in terms of the best technical information in terms of estimating consumptive use, but it's consistent. And I don't think the story would change. Is that since in the last 30 years, the Upper Basin consumptive uses have been flat for several reasons. The big projects are all built. A second one is that we're seeing urbanization. All we got to do is look at Montrose and Grand Junction. Just turn around and drive out west, and every place you see a subdivision where there used to be agriculture, you're seeing less consumptive use. And another fact of reality is that we have used a significant amount of water in the Upper Basin for thermal electric generation. Many of those power plants are scheduled to be shut down. Those decisions are already made. As unlikely there's going to be additional consumptive, you know, uses due to thermal electric. That's just a fact. That's an economic fact. You know, so my prediction is, even with the Lake Powell pipeline, even with some of the, you know, enlargements that Denver's doing, just urbanization and the natural impacts on the West Slope alone will keep our consumptive uses about the same today as they will be in the future. You know, they'll be about the same in the future as they are today. And the big question there is what's temperature increases going to do to consumptive uses on existing crops and lawns. That may go up. But one of those realities on the river, if you look at the data, is the Upper Basin uses are really not going up. Some people could even argue they're going down in certain places.
So Eric, just as comparison, what are the Upper Basin consumptive uses compared to our paper allocation of the compact?
What are the Upper Basin uses? The apportionment under 3A of the compact is 7.5 million acre-feet of annual consumptive use, beneficial consumptive use, is what the compact apportions. Consumptive uses, I could say we're using roughly 4 million acre feet, really 3.7 to 4 in that range. And we're using about another 400,000 or 500,000 acre feet of water that's charged to the upper basin that's evaporative losses from the big reservoirs. That's a man-made consumptive use in the upper basin. And between the two, so it's between 4 and 4.5 million. And it's been in that range, like I say, since the late 1980s.
As compared to what hydrology, what's the water availability generally in the upper basin?
Well, the average inflow into Lake Powell, unregulated inflow, with upstream developments is over 10 million acre feet. In recent years, that's gone down to about 9, but there's still a lot of water in the upper basin. But when you have to deliver that to the to the lower basin, then what's left is our available supply. And right now, that's the big question: what will it be in the future? There's except for go back 2000 to 2017. Lake Powell after 2005, it actually gained storage. We lost a little again this year, but at the end of this water year, at the end of water year 2018, we will still have more water in Lake Powell than we did at the end of the water year in 2005. The system is losing water. The system storage in Meade and Powell is losing water, but Lake Powell is actually a little bit higher, today than it was at this time 13 years ago in 2005.
So are you saying we don't need a big snow year this winter?
Oh, I'd love a big snow year. I know everyone up here, especially now that I'm retired, I would really love a big snow year.
We had a question here.
My question's for Colby. Thanks a lot for your comments on sort of everybody needs to work together on addressing these huge issues. But in the meantime, everyone plans and can control what their own organization is doing. So can you talk a little bit more about, you said Nevada's got 1.8% of the overall flow or whatever. You take water directly out. You've worked so hard on getting rid of turf and all those outdoor uses. And I know that basically your indoor use goes right back to the lake. So can you talk a little bit about that? What's the spread between indoor-outdoor use, and then how does that affect your organization's ability and sort of insulate you or not from this in terms of that, how little you actually take and how much actually goes right back to Lake Meade?
That's a good question. So we divert, in round numbers, 500,000 acre feet of water a year from the Colorado River as a state and return about 250,000. Our estimates of outdoor water use are around 60%, 50-60% in line with that consumptive use. So I don't know that our return flow credits necessarily make it easier for us to deal with the drought. I think what makes it easier for us is we have one water user. The state of Nevada has one large water user. And that's how my agency was formed. In the early 90s, we had, we call them purveyor members. We have 5 different water purveyors that all had different priority Colorado River rights. All of them were looking to continue to grow, and there was still a space in Nevada's allocation. And it became very apparent at that time that if our municipalities began to fight amongst each other for the control of the Colorado River, they were going to cannibalize each other instead of getting the programs and stuff in place that we needed. One of those programs was intentionally created surplus, which is where over 500,000 of our banked resources now sit in Lake Meade. That's to the benefit of us, that's to the benefit of the upper basin. But we had to be able to speak with one voice as far as what the river needed in order to be able to interact with 7 states. And I think that's really what positions us so well on the river today is planning ahead and being able to speak with one voice on behalf of the state for what makes sense.
Repeat the question.
It was, what's the average water bill for our customers? I do not know that number across the top of our head. I do know that we look across major southwestern cities, and we rank right about the 40th percentile. But I think the average water bill is still $20, $30. But that's for a house that's, you know, we have a lot of multifamily units, a lot of single family units. So that could be a new home with no yard, could very easily see a $30 a month water bill. But folks that have a couple thousand square feet of grass, you quickly get up to where you're paying, in some of our jurisdictions, close to $5 per 1,000 gallons. So we have customers that pay thousands of dollars a month, and we have a tiered rate system for that reason, so that your everyday uses don't have the same impact that having luxurious uses like yards and swimming pools have.
We have a question down here.
Yeah, thanks. Can you address the timing of demand management? When do you think it will be necessary in Colorado to have such a program, and when do you think it will be ready?
Sure, Brent. Unfortunately, we don't have a crystal ball. If we have more years like the one we're just, water years that we're just getting out of here, we're going to need it very quickly. And the problem is that a demand management program, Eric touched on this, it's not something that we can do in 1 year. And it's something that probably will take, once it's up and running, would throughout the basin would probably take as many as 10 years to get 1 million to 2 million acre feet of water banked into a pool. And that is a number, you know, between 1 and 2 million acre feet that we're going to need in order for it to make a difference. And so I think one of the things I would point out that I would want to stress is that, you know, it truly depends on the hydrology each year as to how much you could bank. This year, on the western slope, Eric just touched on it from an urban perspective, but from an agriculture perspective, almost every one of our agriculture producers on the western slope practiced demand management this year. They consumed less water, not because they chose to, but because there was less water to consume. We're then asking them in wet years when they could consume water to choose not to. So we can't, we know based on modeling that we really can't produce much voluntary demand management water in a year like this. You couldn't even produce much curtailed, mandatorily curtailed water during a drought year like this in terms of post-compact, straightly out of the post-compact water. So it's a real concern in terms of what kind of hydrology we have in the future in order for that program to work.
2 questions in the back.
I'd like to go back to process just briefly. You talked about avoiding tough decisions and not being winners and losers, but there are likely to be some winners and losers in a final decision, and I think that's unavoidable. Russ spoke eloquently this morning about giving people a voice. And there are some public processes that are clearly people sometimes are willing to lose in some areas if they gain in others. How do you think we can move forward with a process to get to that point?
So it's the hardest question of all because it's never been done, but it's not the worst one to work with. The worst question is, what if you don't do anything? You can just say, well, we can't stop it. Someone's going to lose, so let's just let it happen. It's that result that we're trying to avoid. We can't make more water. We can extend what we have for a while, but in a worst case scenario, which all of this conversation has been and should be for planning purposes, in the end, there are going to be adjustments, changes. There will be curtailments. So what you do is you plan ahead. Everyone gets to the table, and they'll do 2 things. They'll say, well, I can do this. I can't do this. And so if you work the array together, you'll minimize the losses. You won't avoid them, but you won't have the disaster. I think it was Andy's photograph. You know, the picture matters, and it will be like that if we just fail to work towards what best solution we can find. This will happen, and you will have larger losses than you need to, and the losses will be indiscriminate, and it'll begin to shake the existence, the possibility of existence of various parts of the government, certainly certain industries and businesses. That's what you get without doing everything we've talked about today as wise as we can. And because we're all humans, it's going to be kind of a messy process anyway. But if we do it the way we've been talking about today, it'll actually work. Even though there'll be the human ups and downs, it can work. And so that's really what we have to look for. And each of us brace ourselves. What's it going to cost me? But it's the same as we've always done with the roundtables. We always asked ourselves two questions. What is it we need? And then what are we willing to give up to get that? It really brings that home now. Drought got us there sooner than prosperity. And so the one message I think all of us have to walk out of here with today is personal and communal. A lot of farmers, as we've already talked about, figured out the personal side this year. I know most farmers up in Garfield County that live on creeks that normally don't make it clear through the growing season, didn't even start the growing season. So they've already figured out what's personal about drought. And all of us are going to have to see some of that, whether we live in a city on the eastern slope or whether we sit on a farm in the western slope. So we should begin thinking about ourselves. But the rest of the conversation is one that really will make the difference. And that is, what about you? What can I do for you, to our neighbors? That's really the essence of what we should be doing today.
I would just like to add to that, but from a slightly different perspective. I think in the River District Board and Southwestern District Board's conversations, I think we feel really strongly that there need to be sideboards in place. There need to be some rules, as you heard earlier today. And I think, you know, the concern that many of us have had over the last recent weeks or days has been that there's sort of this freight train that's about to roll right over the West Slope without the process and without the opportunity for people to really have a meaningful conversation or understand what the ramifications are. And so I totally agree with your aspirations, but I just don't, I think it would be naive of us to all to feel as though we can simply sing Kumbaya right now and everything's fixed, because I think until we see more transparency and more discussion and we see an opportunity for the roundtables to do their work and the IBCC to do its work, I think when you engender, not you, but when fear is engendered in people, the response is not as favorable towards working things out, as it can be when people do feel as though the process is going to be there to allow full discussion, full factual data to be presented, full information and full opportunity for comment and debate and conversation. So I just want to kind of tie that back into Andy's comments from earlier this morning.
Thank you. Did we have one last question back here?
I'm not sure exactly where I want to start, because I agree with some of Andy's last comments, and I certainly agree with Russ's last comments and Marty's last comments, but I'd like to add a little bit more, and whether you guys want to respond to it or not, it's up to you. You know, we talk about, and we've talked about nothing but water today, and we've talked about nothing but agriculture, that the water's going to come from agriculture. And I understand that. I don't totally agree with all of that. But, you know, as you've indicated, we've been through the drought, we're going through the drought, and a lot of us in agriculture have experienced involuntary curtailment, just because Mother Nature put it out there to us. And I think none of us totally understand the impact upon the resource that is having. And so once we get some hydrology back, then we'll be able to produce again. But in the meantime, our ability to produce and our ability to be economically viable is really curtailed. And so, you know, I'm concerned about, as we move forward and the hydrology doesn't improve and we continue to have the big river issues that we have to address, we're going to automatically lose a lot of agriculture in western Colorado, whether we have demand management by a voluntary method or by an administered process. And if we start losing big chunks of our agricultural economy on the West Slope, what do we do?
Anybody want to take a crack?
Well, he's right.
He's right. As usual.
Bill, you've engendered no opposition. But Eric has a comment.
Yeah, I think one of my comments again on agriculture is irrigation use is a very, very broad brush, of which only a small portion in terms of numbers, maybe a large portion in terms of acre feet of consumptive use, but a small portion in terms of numbers make a living on agriculture. I live in a community above Glenwood Springs that uses an agricultural right. They've got some big pastures, they got all these things, and there's not a penny that goes to anybody's income for agriculture. It's, I call, landscape. And you see it on the Front Range. I think northern Colorado Water Conservancy District has suggested that over half of the farmland, if you want to call it, between I-25 and the mountains, is landscape, and it's people buy it so they can protect their view shed. You know, and so that uses a lot of water in the state, and we really have not. And it's not an urban use. It's not a Denver water use. It's the suburban landscape use of old agricultural rights or agriculture that's not being used for productive agriculture. And my challenge and my question is, how do we protect the productive agriculture and allow, if you want to call it, the things that Colby Pellegrino and their group have done very well, which is they've reduced turf. They've conserved water by reducing turf. How do we do that in Colorado and preserve agriculture? Because I think even on the West Slope, we can reduce a lot of turf and protect viable agriculture. In other words, the people who actually make a living from agriculture. And that's going to be a challenge that, you know, I don't know how you do that, because it's got to get involved in land use. The New West, as you say it, there's a lot of ranches around here that the primary purpose of it is so that somebody can own a ranch and they'll take a picture of it for their Christmas card. And they don't make a living off of it. So that's one of the questions that I have for all of us, is how do we protect the viable agriculture and actually reduce our consumptive uses in landscapes that really aren't necessary to maintain the quality of living. And enough said.
Bill, did you want to say anything more, or were you just going to drop the mic?
No, I totally agree, and I'm glad Eric brought that up because I had those kinds of things in mind. But being an ag guy, usually on the downhill side of a conversation, you hate to broach it yourself. So I thank Eric for bringing those things up. How do we as a society or a culture in Western Colorado decide that we can change our lifestyles for the benefit of being able to have a square meal? You know, basically that's what's coming down to is what's more important, your lifestyle or making sure that we can have adequate food in the nation and the world. You know, you look around and there's lots and lots of water uses that are very, very vulnerable, and they're water uses or water supplies that are very important to agriculture. And Russ and I were talking last night about the Ogallala Basin and what's happening there and how it's supporting the breadbasket of the Midwest. And when that resource goes dry, think about the agricultural reduction in production that's going to be lost there. And at the same time, if we in the mountain country or any area that's being irrigated by flood irrigation that's being taken over by urbanization, if we lose that ability to produce food on those acres, just think about it. That's all I'm asking.
Well, maybe could I add? I'm totally in agreement with what my friends are saying here. Let me just put it in a little different context. You are right. It's understood generally you are right, and it's a part of the foundation of the state water plan. The state water plan, through all of the work that was done there, recognizes exactly these things. The rest of the story of what we're trying to say is when you get into making these choices, the real question is not the choice you make, but who gets to make the choice? Who gets to choose? And one of the reasons that local control has governed land use planning is that it's been the conscious choice in this wonderful state we live in to let those choices be made by the people who are affected mostly. And that's generally at home, and that's local control. And so now when we elevate this conversation in the face of a very serious foe, in this case, drought, it begins to squeeze our ability to have that kind of freedom. And for us to take the time and be able to work it through so that the right people who are affected get to make all those choices. There gets to be lots of pressure that those choices be made by others. And so that's what we have to watch out for. So in the water plan, we spent a lot of time trying to get past that. And so there are sections in there talking directly about combining water choices with land use choices. It can be done. It will have to be done. But you have to be careful how you do it because you're getting to that fundamental question of who is telling who what to do with their personal lives. So I think we've got the process in pretty good place. It's just a matter of us using it and probably getting more serious than we thought we had to on time.
This question is obviously directed towards the state of Utah. How will a call on the Colorado River affect the state of Utah, and what is Utah's contingency plan for it?
That's a great question. You know, obviously, call on the river is something that none of the upper basin states want. We expect that the water rights would be clicked off by priority once the states have got together and figured out how much, how much water needs to be cut by each state. Each year in the state of Utah, the state engineers having to prioritize, not prioritize, but cut by priority water rights. And so even in the upper reaches of the Colorado and the Green River, so we've been through that. To tell you exactly how that's going to happen, I don't know. I know that's been the subject of discussion amongst the states and within the state of Utah for a lot of years, but something that does need to be worked out in the event that we get ever close to that.
Was there one last question? Well, they've both had multiple cracks at it, so I don't care.
My question for the panel would just be, say Eric gets his wish, my wish, everybody's wish, and we have a good snow year or an average snow year. How do we keep this discussion going? How do we keep everyone at the table? Because the risk is long-term, as everyone's presented today, but so often it seems like the discussion is governed by what's going on in the current year.
Well, I would just point out that back up the clock to 2017 was a good year, and at least in the Colorado River Basin and in the reservoirs the River District manages, we had good years in 2014, 15, 16, and 17, and here we are today. So one year does not make a drought, and one good wet year obviously does not solve a problem in the basin. And I think if you look at as a whole long run, we still have a problem, and I think the basin, I think, has learned from this 19-year period that you cannot make decisions based on 1 year alone. And my guess is my prediction is if we have a good year next year, the conversations will continue. And we'll get what we'll need. We'll be just getting ready for the next 2018.
Well, and I would just add to that I think it's the obligation of my district, everybody at this table, everybody in this room, in our communities, to stress, and our press, whom, unlike some of the federal agencies, we love the press. We want you to help us get our message out. We need the public to understand that this is a long-term structural problem that needs everybody to chip in to fix. It has to be collaborative. It has to be long-term. We are going to have to change how we function as a society in every sector of water use. And so we need to keep that message in dry years. I mean, I'd love to think that we had a record attendance because I came on as general manager this year. The reality is we had a record attendance because it's a drought. And that's what happens. And so we need to help keep that message alive. It's really, frankly, critical.
I think that would be the concluding remark. Thank you for being a great audience and making this session yours. Let's give our panelists a final round of applause.